Good evening, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to our midweek study focused on the theme of Cloud of Witnesses. We took a little break from that theme last Wednesday evening as we had a lesson related to the concepts of thankfulness and gratitude, concepts that always need to dominate our hearts as children of God and disciples of Jesus Christ. But especially around the Thanksgiving holiday, are we reminded about just how much we have to be grateful for, even in the midst of this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And among those things for which we are grateful is the ability to connect through a medium like this, to share time together in the Word of God. And I hope that as we continue toward a conclusion of this study in a few weeks, that we'll continue to be blessed and encouraged by looking at men and women of faith who have lived in centuries and millennia past, who faced the same struggles that we faced, encountered the same temptations that we encounter, and yet maintained a deep-seated faithfulness to God. Despite imperfection, despite being flawed, they were faithful to God. And tonight we do that in considering the life of Joseph, just part one of a consideration of his life, as there's just too much in Scripture to try to condense into one lesson. And maybe Joseph isn't one of those people that immediately comes to mind when you think of characters in the Old Testament, and yet his role in the unfolding of God's eternal plan is just so vital and extremely significant. The Latin phrase locus classicus is a phrase that just means a passage that is considered to be the best known or the most authoritative on a particular subject. And so it was the commentator Derek Kidner, I believe, who said that the story of Joseph is the locus classicus of the providence of God. That is, Joseph's story serves as a standard in demonstrating the providence of God, demonstrating God's providential care and provision in the life of one of his faithful children. And Joseph's story, on so many levels, is truly a powerful reminder that God's plan can't be undone. It can't be thwarted by the scheming of the wicked and the scheming of the unbelieving. It may look at times like they're dominating, like they're winning, but God's plan is not going to be undone. Obviously, we encounter Joseph in the book of Genesis, and a lot of times we think of Genesis, this book of beginnings, as being the book of Adam, and a few generations later, the book of Noah. And then we're introduced a few chapters after Noah to Abraham. But it's quite true that Genesis is also very much the book of Joseph and an exhibition of God's power in Joseph's life. Genesis has 50 chapters, and 13 of those chapters, just a little over 1/4 of the book of Genesis, is directly related to the life of Joseph. If you want to go a little further than that, chapter 26 begins the story of Jacob. And from there on, it's the story of Jacob and his family and Joseph. So even if you don't account for any gaps in the genealogies in the book of Genesis, even though Genesis covers about the first 25 generations of human history, half of the book, chapters 26 through 50, concern just two of those generations, the generation of Jacob and the generation of Joseph. From Joseph are going to come two of the 12 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And Joseph's efforts in sparing the lives of his brothers, particularly his brother Judah, ensured the survival of the descendants of Abraham and ensured the survival of the lineage that would ultimately lead to Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, of note in the book of Acts is the sermon of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, in which he sort of rehearses in condensed form the story of God's dealings with his people, the descendants of Abraham. And within that sermon, that's probably in condensed form in Acts chapter 7. Joseph gets 7 verses within that sermon. He gets mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, that chapter that sort of serves as the rationale and the basis for this study in the first place. That great hall of fame of faith that, as chapter 12 begins, refers to these men and women of faith as this great cloud of witnesses. Joseph gets mentioned in one verse of Hebrews chapter 11, but interestingly, it's not really in regard to any of the things that we'll be discussing much in these lessons on his life. It doesn't talk about the hatred of his brothers toward him, his being sold as a slave, his rising to prominence in Egypt. What's mentioned about Joseph's faith in Hebrews chapter 11 is right at the end of his life, with his dying breath, and in his last words, he mentions the future exodus of his descendants and the descendants of his brothers from Egypt. He mentions the carrying of his bones out of Egypt back to the land of promise. That's the aspect of Joseph's faith and faithfulness that the preacher in Hebrews chapter 11 wants to draw a lesson from. But still, his life and God's working in his life are certainly worthy of our study and our consideration. We're going to be working heavily tonight out of Genesis chapter 37 and Genesis chapters 38 and 37 and then 39. And so if you'll be turning there, Genesis 38 is a sort of sidetrack in regard to the story of Judah and Tamar and the birth of 2 sons by Tamar to Judah, sons that are named Perez and Zerah. Perez is the one who continues the messianic line. So we'll be looking at Genesis 37 and Genesis 39 tonight, and then picking up with Genesis 40 next week. Genesis 37 in verse 2 says, this is the account of Jacob's family line. That's the 2011 edition of the NIV. This is the account of Jacob's family line. In earlier translations, you might find something like, this is the record of the generations of Jacob. And this word that's translated record is the Hebrew word toledot. And the Hebrew word toledot is very prominent in the record of Genesis, and it sort of produces 10 or 11 natural divisions within the book. And included in the meanings of toledot are descendants, generations, account, record, or story. Thus, in the New King James Version, it's translated genealogy. In the New Revised Standard Version, it's translated as the story. And here in the NIV, it's the account of Jacob's family line. And these provide the natural divisions within the book of Genesis. Back in Genesis 5:1, this is the written account of Adam's family line. Chapter 6, verse 9, this is the account of Noah and his family. In Genesis chapter 10, verse 1, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. So the chapter before the one we're beginning in tonight, Genesis 36, Genesis 37 is going to give us the account of Jacob's family line. The previous chapter gives us the account of his brother's family line. Genesis 36:1, this is the account, the toledot of the family line of Esau, that is Edom. And this is really where we get the beginning of Joseph's story. It was 7 chapters earlier, Genesis chapter 30, where we read about Joseph's birth, but that's all we read about, his birth and the name that he was given. It's in chapter 37 that we are introduced to this 17-year-old who was the 11th born son of Jacob. And we find him as a young man in what I'm tempted to call a somewhat dysfunctional family. I would probably upgrade that to a quite dysfunctional family. Among the sons of Jacob are 4 sets of step siblings. You have the children of Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, 6 sons and a daughter named Dinah that are born to Jacob by Leah. There are the 2 sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. And then there are the 2 sons of Rachel's handmaid, Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. Leah also had a handmaid, Zilpah, who bore 2 sons to Jacob. Their names were Gad and Asher. And so among these 12 sons are 4 sets of half siblings. The eldest of those sons, Reuben, is going to have an incestuous sexual encounter with Bilhah, who was the mother of 2 of his stepbrothers. This takes place after the death of Rachel. And there had always been rivalry between Rachel and her sister Leah. Leah is described as being beautiful of face and form, beautiful in figure and in facial attractiveness. Leah is described as having weak eyes. Rachel was clearly the bride of choice, but Leah is the one who's able to have children long before Rachel is. In fact, Leah has all 6 of her sons and her daughter Dinah before Joseph is even born to Rachel. And so, as you can imagine, tension in such a family is inevitable, not just among the 2 wives and the 2 handmaids, but especially among the siblings. And between Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah, there would be conversations that would include the pronouns mine and yours in regard to the children. There would be distinctions made between the sons of the wives and those of the handmaids. And it's not long into Genesis 37 that we learn that on top of all that is thrown in this parental favoritism, fatherly favoritism toward Joseph by Jacob among all of his sons. Verse 3 of Genesis 37, now Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe. He made an ornate robe for him. Jacob seems to have been very open and unabashed in his favoritism toward Joseph. This was apparent even a few chapters earlier when Jacob, after years of estrangement, years of running from his brother Esau out of fear for his life, there comes a reunion and a reconciliation. But Jacob really wasn't sure how this was going to go. He knew it could go badly. It could go disastrously. So he sort of staged his wives and his children as they went to meet Esau. Out front, he put Zilpah and Bilhah, the 2 handmaids, and their children. Behind them were Leah and her children, and at the very back were Rachel and Joseph and Benjamin. The safest place to be. He was showing that favoritism even there. Joseph is called the child of his own age. Depending on the way you do the math, some have suggested that Jacob was 74 years old when Joseph was born, others that he was 77. Others believe that Jacob was 91 years old. He's going to live to the age of 147, but many believe that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born, the first child born to him by his beloved wife, Rachel. And so there were maybe some understandable reasons why Joseph would be so favored. And he's given this multicolored tunic, this varicolored tunic, a coat of many colors, the King James Version translates it. But those translations of varicolored and multicolored and coat of many colors is a translation of the words that appear in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible and the Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew word itself that they are translating is quite difficult to translate. And so in more contemporary English translations, we don't get coat of many colors and we don't get multicolored coat. We get things like the New Revised Standard Version's translation of a full-length robe with sleeves. In the original edition of the NIV, it was translated a richly ornamented robe. In the 2011 edition of the NIV, it's translated simply as an ornate robe. The New Living Translation calls it a beautiful robe. Whatever it was special, it was unique. None of the other sons had it. It was a distinctive gift, a distinctive sign and symbol upon Joseph. Some commentators have suggested if a robe with long sleeves is a correct translation. Some commentators have suggested that short sleeves, or sometimes no shirt at all, were worn by slaves, by servants. Long sleeves were worn by those who were privileged, those who were given lesser demands of work, those who were exempted from work. And if that's correct, if these newer translations are correct, then it sort of renders as obsolete a lot of those Bible class materials that I grew up with, when you got the printout of Joseph and his robe and the big crayon box or the colored pencils, and you got to color in all those different colors into his robe. Whatever it was, whether it had many colors or was just very ornate, it distinguished Joseph among his brothers as being the favorite of his father. And this is something that's always not just dysfunctional, but devastating within families. And Jacob, of all people, should have known that, because he grew up himself in that situation, and he reaped the harvest of that kind of favoritism for much of his life in his estrangement from his brother Esau. Genesis 25:28 just flatly says, Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob was mama's boy, and it took them years, most of their lives, to overcome that and finally be reconciled in their latter years. Chapter 37 gives us the record of the deteriorating relationship between Joseph and his brothers. Verse 2, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, that is Dan and Naphtali, and the sons of Zilpah, that's Gad and Asher. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, whether he is acting totally sincerely and genuinely out of concern for the interests of his father, that somehow the flocks were being neglected, that his sons were negligent in their duties, that's a possibility. It's possible that he's also this willing bearer of bad news about his brother. Regardless of his motivation and his intent, he's going to be considered a spoiled tattletale by his brothers. And it says at the end of verse 4 that his brothers hated him. When his brothers perceived this favoritism, his brothers hated him, could not speak a kind word to him. After the dreams began to be shared, verse 5, they hated him all the more. The end of verse 8, they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. Verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him. And this just intensifies as the text moves on. And what just exacerbates this and intensifies it greatly is the sharing of his dreams with his brothers. The first dream that he shares with them was, we were out binding sheaves of grain. And how you bind sheaves of grain, you cut the stalks of grain, you get a bunch together, you tie them together, and you lie them down. At that point, all the sheaves of grain are lying on the ground, but Joseph's stands upright, and all the other sheaves of his brothers gather around his and bow down to it. And however he told it was in a way that just immediately grated on his brothers. Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more. And as if that dream wasn't bad enough, he tells them the next dream. He says in verse 9, he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Didn't learn the lesson from the first one. Listen, if you like the first dream, you're going to love this. If you hated the first dream, you're really going to hate this one, because it's not just sheaves of grain here. It's the celestial bodies themselves that are bowing down to Joseph. I had another dream. This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He not only tells this to his brothers, but also to his father. His father rebukes him, and that must have been difficult for Jacob to do. Sometimes when there is a pampered, spoiled, favored child, the last thing that the parent wants to do is to risk offense. But this is enough of an issue for Jacob to rebuke Joseph over. What is this dream you had? Verse 10. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His mother Rachel was already dead, but from the elements of the dream, his father seems to pick up that he's the sun, the moon is his mother Rachel, and the 11 stars are his brothers. But still, Jacob keeps the saying in mind, sort of like Mary in Luke chapter 2 treasures up these things in her heart, the things that were spoken by the shepherds, the things that were spoken by Simeon. She treasured those in her heart. At verse 12, we're told that Joseph is sent by his father Jacob to check on the welfare of his brothers who were shepherding Jacob's flocks at Shechem. Now, where Jacob and Joseph were was at the valley of Hebron. Shechem was 45 miles away. So it's not like Jacob is telling Joseph, go out to the north 40 and check on your brothers. This is a journey of 45 miles that is going to have to take place, a dangerous journey. However, his brothers have moved in the meantime from Shechem to Dothan, another 15 miles away. So it's a total of about 60 miles that Joseph has to go to find his brothers. And as they saw him approaching from a distance, and they probably recognized him by his size, by his gait. Everyone has their own unique stride and gait when they walk. But the story is going to make plain as well that Joseph is wearing his ornate robe, his beautiful robe that his father has given him. And so comes this taunt from his brothers. Here comes that dreamer. I don't know when Joseph was sharing the stories of his dreams with his brothers, if the fact that his father had been a dreamer too ever came up. Jacob has a dream at a place called Luz, and his dream is of a ladder with its base on the earth and the top of it extending to the heavens, and the Lord being at the top of that ladder, and angels ascending and descending the ladder. It's there at Luz that God reiterates the promise that had been given to Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father. Jacob is told, I am going to make a great nation of you. This land is going to be yours. And Jacob realizes that the Lord has met him there. And so he changes the name. He takes the stone that he had used as a pillow and sets it up as a pillar and dedicates it to the Lord. He names the place Beth-El, house of God. God was here, and I didn't know it. Jacob had had a dream. Joseph has had these dreams, and they just refer to him as this dreamer. And then just unimaginably, verse 20, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal has devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. It's hard to imagine that these brothers hate him so much. They've had the luxury of not having to be around him, but just the very thought of him disturbs them so much that just in seeing him, that they want to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, who's got moral problems of his own, but he doesn't want to shed the blood of his next to youngest brother. Verse 21, Reuben heard this, tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Although Reuben is included in those who hate him and are jealous of him, he doesn't want to kill his own flesh and blood. He's got a rescue plan in mind, but it's not going to be able to happen. So when he came near, verse 23, they stripped him of his robe and they threw him into this dry cistern. Normally in the rainy season and after the rainy season, it would be full of water. Must be the dry season now because it is a dry cistern. And then they sit down to eat a meal. Verse 25, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Gilead was in the Transjordan area, the area to the east of the Jordan River. These caravanners are going to be alternately called Ishmaelites and Midianites. In the text, I think it calls them Ishmaelites 3 times and Midianites 2 times, but referring to the same group of people. They're not too distant relatives from these brothers. They're half second or half third cousins of Jacob's sons. Both Ishmael and Midian were sons of Abraham. Ishmael born to Abraham by Hagar, Midian born to Abraham by Keturah. And they are loaded down with these treasures, loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. It's apparent from the direction they're headed that they're going to Egypt. And that's when Judah, the fourth oldest brother, he was the fourth born son of Leah. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. It's amazing that they agree, he is our flesh and blood, so let's just sell him as a slave. We won't kill him, but let's just sell him. They sell him for 20 shekels of silver. Later, when the law of Moses is written, 20 shekels of silver is going to be the redemption price of a male servant between the ages of 5 and 20. Reuben is not there when this happens. Verse 29, Reuben returned to the cistern, saw that Joseph wasn't there, tore his clothes, went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I now turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Not only do they have such hatred for their brother, they have such disrespect for their father. They know how precious this son was to Jacob. They have to know the emotional toll and impact that this is going to have on him, but they do it anyway. And it is ironic that it is with the blood of a goat that Jacob is deceived into thinking that his beloved son Joseph is dead. It was the skin of a goat, the hair of a goat that Jacob himself had put on the back of his hands and on his neck to lie to his father Isaac, to deceive his father Isaac into giving him his blessing. And so it's sadly ironic how this deception earlier in Jacob's life, the one who's named deceiver or heel grabber, how this returns in the deception that his sons carry out on him. The text continues, Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth. Actually, verse 33, he recognized the robe and said, "It is my son's. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth, mourns for his son many days, and all his sons and daughters come to comfort him, but he refuses to be comforted. And in preparing for tonight's lesson, I came across something. I must have read it numerous times before, but just the words that Jacob uses in describing his ongoing grief. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." There's not going to be a day that I draw breath that I'm not going to weep and mourn over the loss of my son. It's going to affect me every day for the rest of his life. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph into Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So Joseph goes from being this privileged, favored, somewhat spoiled son to a lowly foreign slave in a distant land. And undoubtedly, he's distressed, but he probably feels blessed just to be alive. He becomes a domestic servant in the household of Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, more or less the director of the secret service in Egypt. Potiphar was in charge of the detail that was dispatched for the protection of Egypt's ruler. And though Joseph had been abandoned and sold by his brothers, he knew that he had not been abandoned and forsaken by his God. If we start, again, chapter 38 is about Judah and Tamar. And so we have to go to chapter 39 to continue Joseph's story. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken them there. And now notice verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Yahweh, the Lord, hasn't appeared much in the story yet of Joseph and his brothers, but that's not going to be the case going forward. And it reminds us that Joseph must have heard the stories from his father Jacob about Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac, and also his father Jacob, the promises that had been made, the mighty acts of God that had taken place in their lives because of him. And while Joseph lives centuries before the life of one of Judah's descendants, David, the son of Jesse, I think many of the things that David writes in the Psalms would have resonated very strongly with Joseph as he finds himself as a slave in Egypt, starting with Psalm 3, verses 1 through 6. Lord, how many are my foes? Even my own brothers are my foes. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. His brothers probably wrote him off. There's no way he can survive. There's no way things can go well for our brother. Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord. He answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Going on over to Psalm 27, verse 1. The Lord is my light. Yahweh is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? You think about the emotions that must have gone through Joseph's mind as he was in that cistern. And then as he was drawn out, he probably wondered, am I going to live? Am I going to die? And then to be sold to these foreigners, chained up, taken down to Egypt. Yet he believes that the Lord will sustain him. The Lord will preserve him. And he knows that even though he is a long way from the land that's ultimately going to be given to their descendants, he knows that Yahweh isn't a territorial God like these false gods, these pagan gods. He is wherever his people are. And so I think what David writes in Psalm 139 would have resonated with Joseph as well, especially verses 7 through 12 of Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the sea, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Um, Joseph begins to work in a way that not only brings about the favor of God, but brings about the favor of his master Potiphar as well. And I think we're not going to be able to even get as far as I thought we were going to be able to get tonight. But I did want to mention one thing about his work ethic. You know, he could have just felt sorry for himself. He could have bemoaned the fact that everything seems to have gone against him, from favored son to foreign slave. And yet, knowing that God is with him, he goes about his work every day as if he's working for the Lord rather than working for Potiphar. And this is the instruction. Again, this is a couple of millennia before Ephesians will be written, but Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8, and though written so long after the life of Joseph, Joseph embodies this attitude and this work ethic. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with certainty of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. I think we'll just wrap up the study here tonight. We've got a lot more to continue. We're not going to cover it in part 2. It may take part 3 to get this done. But again, thank you for being a part of the study tonight. We'll pick up here in Genesis 39 next week and continue the story of God's providential working and powerful working in the life of Joseph. I look forward to seeing all of you on Sunday, either in the auditorium or through the live stream. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful rest of your week. Good night, and God bless you.